Well, good morning. My name's Don. I'm one of the pastors here, and this weekend has been our biennial CE conference that we've called Flourish, What Jesus Said About Happiness. And yesterday we had a great morning hearing from Dr. Jonathan Pennington, who is our guest speaker for us this morning as we prepare to hear God's Word opened for us. I wanted to let you know a little bit about him. He is the professor of New Testament interpretation at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. That's where I went to school. And he is also the pastor of spiritual formation at Sojourn East, a church in Louisville as well, where he gets to preach regularly to his church there. He is the author of numerous books. He's a prolific scholar and has written many articles and scholarly journals and so forth, and preaches and teaches around the country. And he was also, I think it was my first semester, maybe even my first class at Southern, where I went to my New Testament 1 Gospels class with Dr. Pennington. And that class had more impact on me than any other class I took at seminary. In fact, every time I preach the Gospels, which we're going through John right now as a church, I use what he taught me in that class. So I'm really excited that he gets to share with us this morning. So would you welcome him for us?
Thanks, Don. That's very kind, Don. Thank you. It's so good to be with you this week, and I met several of you yesterday. It was such a delight to be here, and I look forward to meeting more of you today. You know, several years ago, back in the late 80s and early 90s, my wife and I were in college. We had some friends from college who went on to be missionaries in Hungary, and we stayed in touch with them. Our lives kind of went different ways, but then after they came back from the mission field, we connected, and when they came back, they brought me this gift. It's very interesting. It was a poster. It's an old-style poster. It's probably from the late 1800s or early 1900s, and it is all in Hungarian, which makes it pretty cool. My Hungarian's not very good. Yours probably isn't either. But this poster is really, really striking because it's again in this old illustrated style, and it's oriented top to bottom, and it's split in half, or at least like 2/3 and 1/3 split between the two parts. And in this poster, you see all kinds of little things happening. On the one side, you've got people doing lots of good things, like helping the elderly and going to church and doing all kinds of good works, helping the sick, etc. And at the top of that side of the poster, you see the celestial city with angels there and people entering into this. And then on the other side, which is a bigger portion, you see people doing all kinds of bad stuff, like especially 19th century bad stuff, like betting on dog fights. And I think there's like a boy, whatever, one of those big hoops that they would roll around or something. I don't know what they're doing. There are all kinds of people doing obviously bad things on the side. And on the top of that side of the poster, you see this picture of a city of destruction and fire and demons and all kinds of destruction. Now there's a verse at the very bottom of the poster. Now again, it's in Hungarian, but it's pretty easy to figure out what it is. And it's the text I want to talk to you about today, Matthew 7:13-14, where Jesus says, "Enter by the narrow gate, for easy and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and few are those who find it. But narrow and difficult is the narrow way that leads to life, and few are those who find it." This poster that I've describes how Christians, I think, have long understood this famous saying from Jesus. And of course, it's not difficult to understand why. We can all think of people in our lives, and maybe ourselves at times as well, who have made poor choices and live ungodly lives, and the result is, according to the Bible, that they reap destruction upon themselves. So our experience, combined with a pretty straightforward sounding teaching from Jesus, helps us understand that there are two ways in our lives: a broad and easy way that leads to destruction, and a narrow and difficult way that leads to life. And while I understand that in one sense we can affirm that as we live, so our lives end up, I want to suggest to you today that that is not quite what these verses are talking about. It's a little different than what we might first think if you read them carefully. When we read them in the context of Matthew, in the context of the Sermon on the Mount, what we're going to look at, I think these words from Jesus are even more powerful and more poignant than what we might first think. Now, my wife, Tracy, is a very skilled and creative artist. She owns an art studio, and she teaches classes and has works all over. And her medium is Italian glass tile mosaics. And she does amazing things with these little tesserae, these little pieces of Italian glass tile that she nips and cuts and scores and shapes into tiny little pieces. And it's quite remarkable to see. And what I'd like you to think about the Sermon on the Mount and these verses that I want to concentrate on this morning is, it's like the whole Sermon on the Mount is like this elaborate mosaic that's been put together by a very skilled artist. And there are lots of different pieces in it. And each of them are beautiful in themselves. But just like with the mosaic, you have to step back from it to actually see the picture. And so what I want to do is actually help us understand this morning what's going on in the Sermon on the Mount overall so that we can understand these verses. Or maybe it's like, I don't know if you, depending on your age, maybe you grew up reading some of the same magazines I did, like Ranger Rick or these kind of things, and they'd have these like eye bender pictures. Have you seen those where it's like super close up, and so it's like maybe an orange or a fly or something, and you're so close up to it, or a doorknob, you can't quite see what it is, and the key is you have to be able to imagine stepping back so you can see what it is. Well, that's what I want to help us do today, is I want to look at these verses, these pretty famous verses from Matthew 7:13 to 14 within the Sermon on the Mount, and ask, what's the big picture that helps us understand these verses? So if you have a Bible, or you can pull it up in your phone, I want you to turn to Matthew chapter 7, and again, we'll look at verses 13 to 14. Well, actually, what I want you to do is turn back to Matthew chapter 5, because that's where I want to start. I want to run through a big overview of what's going on in Jesus' most famous teaching, the Sermon on the Mount, before we land in these two verses. And when we do this flyover, I want to give you a hook to think about. I want to give you an idea to think about what's going on here, and it's the word cardiographic. All right, I want you to think about this. Cardiographic, and I want to show you what I mean. The Sermon on the Mount starts with these very famous teachings of Jesus that we call the Beatitudes in chapter 5, verses 3 to 12. And I'd summarize this section of the Beatitudes with a simple question is, Jesus is asking us and inviting us to think about what's the way of being in the world that is truly going to result in your flourishing or happiness? What's the way that is blessed? Not just in a kind of hashtag blessed when you're on the beach in Florida or something, but what is the truly flourishing way of being Jesus is inviting us to think about? And if you look at those first 12 verses of the Sermon on the Mount, you'll see that what is consistent throughout them is Jesus is talking about the posture of our hearts. What's going on inside of us? If you look through there, he talks about poverty of spirit and humility and meekness and making peace and hungering and thirsting for God. All of these are things that are true about our inner person. They're all about our posture of heart. They're not just about external behaviors, although our heart is going to result in some external behaviors. Jesus is telling us right at the beginning that God sees and cares about our hearts, our inner person. And if you continue then after these verses in chapter 5, you'll see the same cardio-focused, this heart-focused message continues. In chapter 5, beginning verse 17 and following, and then especially in 5:20, we hear these shocking words from Jesus that our righteousness has to be greater than the scribes and Pharisees if we're to enter the kingdom of heaven. And if you know anything about the scribes and Pharisees from the New Testament, maybe you do, maybe you don't, but if you know anything about them, they were the extra super holy people, as the Jesus Storybook Bible calls them, if you've seen that. They were the super conservative people. They had a very high view of the Bible. They were very conservative in all their morality. They lived very good moral lives. They fasted 2 days out of 7 every week. They tithed single thing they got. They were very pious, holy people. They were the good guys in so many ways. And Jesus says, you and I, if we're going to be his disciples, have to have a righteousness that's greater than theirs. That's crazy. What does it mean? Well, if you let your eyes flow down in 5:21 and following, and really for quite a few verses, we'll see that what Jesus says about having a righteousness that is more than the scribes and Pharisees does not mean that Jesus is calling us to do even more holy and spiritual and pious religious things. No, what he's saying is it means the deeper and more difficult reality of looking inside at your heart. Just like he said in the Beatitudes, now he's saying as well that the posture of our heart is what God really sees and cares about. So in matters such as anger and lust and adultery and divorce and oath-taking and revenge-taking and loving your enemies, if you look over chapter 5, verses 21 to 48, you'll see that in all these things, the point is just outward religiosity, just being moral on the outside, misses the point that God sees and knows and cares about who we are on the inner person. That's why at the very end of this section, if you look at 5:48, you'll see that we need to have a whole or perfect or pure or singly devoted heart because God sees and cares about our hearts. Now stick with me. We're going through it quickly here. If you look in chapter 6 then, and we're trying to step back and look at the whole Mosaic picture. When you look at chapter 6, we see that Jesus continues teaching the same thing. And I called this section the danger of the POM. That is, the danger of seeking the praise of men. I would prefer to say the praise of others, but the acronym of that is a little uncomfortable. So we'll just go with the praise of men, if you can forgive me for that. And what you see in 6:1 to 21, that once again, in areas of giving to help the poor, in prayer, and in fasting, Jesus says, watch out for the praise of men, that if you're doing things in the heart to receive praise from others rather than to seek to please God, this is a danger. So once again, the emphasis on who we are on the inside, our motives, what's going on, not just our exterior behavior, but what's going on the inside. And in the latter part of chapter 6, you see the same issue comes up. He says you and I cannot love or serve both God and wealth. If you try to do that, if you try to have in your heart a love for both the world and God, the result is going to be anxiety, not peace, not shalom. It's going to be anxiety. So are we sensing a pattern yet? I don't think it's difficult to see that there's this consistent pattern, what I call a cardiographic reading, that Jesus is encouraging us, challenging us to look inside, because what God cares about is our inner person. Yes, he cares about our exterior behavior, but he most of all cares about who we are on the inside. And if we looked at chapter 7, we could see the same thing, but here's the point. God sees and cares about your heart, your inner person. And all of this is focused on Jesus offering the true and full life, the life of flourishing in God's kingdom. Now, in light of what I said, let's go back and read chapter 7, verses 13 and 14 again. He says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and many enter in through it. But how narrow the gate is, and how difficult the way is that leads to life, and how few find it." Now, here's the question. How did those verses relate to everything that Jesus has just been saying? He's just been saying that God sees and cares about the heart, the inner person. But when we hear those verses, I think we immediately start thinking of them in the sense of just behavior, that all these bad things in the world are things that we should not do, but we should do the good things. We should live the narrow way. And I think when most of us think about the narrow way of Jesus, we think of doing good deeds and, out of faith, but doing good deeds. And I think also when we read verses 13 and 14, maybe your eye or ear catches the numeric issue, the few versus the many. And I think there is something to that there are more people who are not Christians than there are Christians. There are more people that it's much easier to live this way of just kind of doing whatever you want, living immorally, and there are fewer people to do the hard work of actually living with integrity. Those are all true. But I'd like to suggest to you that the contrast here is not so much the numbers of people, but it's the contrast between the ease of the one way that is broad and the difficulty and the narrowness of the other, one resulting in life and one death. And so far, you may be thinking, well, again, isn't this sounds like behavior? But quite the opposite. I think that Jesus is saying here that the easy way, the way that is easy and broad that anybody can do, is the way that focuses on external, outward behavior, or simply put, typical religion. And the hard way, the difficult way of life, by contrast, is the way that he has been teaching all along throughout the sermon, focusing on our hearts, not being content to just be a good person outwardly, but recognizing and embracing the fact that God sees and cares most about the posture of our heart. That's the difficult way. The more difficult way of living, the way of the righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, is the way when you and I look inside and start not just concentrating on outward behavior, but on who we are on the inside. Think with me for a minute about the people Jesus is talking to. Again, he's talking to the Pharisees, and they were very righteous people. They didn't sleep around. They didn't steal from other people. They were truly upright people. Those are the people he's addressing. And yet he says to them, you need something more than just this outward behavior. You need an inner transformation. Because the difficult way, friends, the narrow way, is when we start to actually focus honestly on our hearts. That's far more difficult than just concentrating on our behavior. This is the way that cuts to the quick in our hearts, and at times may require us to pluck out an eye or cut off a limb, as Jesus says. Jesus is saying, you may be doing the relatively easy thing of not actually leaving your wife and committing adultery with another woman, oh man. But are you at every turn lusting for another man's wife, maybe imagining what it would be like to be in some other marriage, to take her into your arms, or seeking ways to relate to the opposite sex in subtle, flirtatious ways that scratch the itch of lust in your heart? The easy way is the one that looks at the mere behavior of not committing adultery and says, I haven't committed adultery. But the more difficult way is being honest about looking inside your heart about what's going on. Or are you and I taking the broad and easy way of religion that, I don't kill people when they wrong me, but is my heart overflowing with loathing and anger and bitter words, or ways that you drop little criticisms of other people that come out of resentment because someone's hurt me? Or are you and I taking the relatively easy and broad way of practicing our piety? Maybe you give very generously to the church, and maybe you go to every prayer meeting, and maybe you even deny yourself certain pleasures. But are you practicing it in a way that actually keeps God at arm's length? And are you practicing it in a way that you want to make sure that people see that you're doing good deeds? You see, it's the heart. It's the inner person that God sees and cares about. That's the difficult way, the way of utter nakedness before God, utter and painful honesty, facing who we honestly are and allowing ourselves to be laid open and bare before God, to let the Word of God point and dig deeply into our hearts to divide even bone and marrow. That's the narrow way that Jesus is calling us to, the way of the heart. That's the way of the righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, not just focusing on external behavior, but looking inside. Do you remember the story from Matthew chapter 19? It's in the other Gospels as well, of the rich young ruler, where you have this man who is very pious. He's truly a good man. He's respected in society. He's generous. He's keeping the commands of God. And he hears about Jesus. And he hears that something's going on. And so he goes to meet with Jesus. And Jesus talks with them and demands, what must I do to be good? And Jesus says, obey God's commands. And he says, I have. And I don't think there's any reason to think that he's being insincere. He was truly a good man, just like many of us here. But then Jesus tells him to sell all his possessions, give to the poor, and come and follow him. Why? Because he doesn't tell everybody to do that, and not all Christians, most Christians throughout history have not done that. In fact, if everybody did that, then there wouldn't be anything to give, and you wouldn't be able to do anything, right? That's not a call to everyone to give everything. Why does he call this man to give up everything he has and follow him? Well, if you look at Matthew 19 and into 20, you'll see it's very clear why. Because the man had a heart problem. Jesus knew that in his inner person, he loved money more than God. So he was righteous on the outside. He was doing all the good things. He was a much more pious person than any of us here, I'm sure. And the issue was cardiographic. The issue was that Jesus was able to see, as a good doctor of the soul, that this man had a problem of the heart. How I like to say it is, the narrow way is the marrow way. It's not just on the outside, it's not just flesh, it's not on the outward deeds, it's actually looking inside. What did that man lack? He lacked a heart that is oriented toward God. Friends, there is something very profound and very challenging here in Jesus' teachings, that the easy way that leads to destruction is not, yes, it is immoral behavior, but what he's primarily saying is the easy way that leads to destruction is being a good Christian on the outside. Where you come to church, you're faithful, you give, maybe you serve in the nursery, but you're not willing to look inside at what God sees and cares about. Do you remember the great story from the Old Testament? The first two kings of Israel, King Saul and King David. And if we were to do a resume for King Saul and King David about their morality and their uprightness, what are King Saul's problems? Well, a couple of things. When he feels a lot of peer pressure because the prophet Samuel is late in showing up after he conquered these people and he's supposed to offer sacrifices, and he feels pressure from the people, and so he goes ahead and offers the sacrifice, and like 5 minutes later Samuel comes up, and that was wrong. What he did was wrong. And there are a couple other things he did wrong, for sure. Let's look at David's resume. David, at the height of his powers, when God has blessed him immensely, is up on the roof. He sees another man's wife, takes her for his own, probably against her will. They have a child. When they find out that she's pregnant, he engages in this deception to try to make it look like it's not his child. When that doesn't work, he has her husband killed in battle. Now, here's the shocking thing. According to God, which king is the good king? It's shocking. Saul is rejected by God, and David is exalted. Not because immorality doesn't matter. In fact, it has a huge impact. That David never fully escapes the consequences of that in his life. It wreaks havoc for generations in his family and in his own life as well. But what is the difference, according to the Bible, between Saul and David? Do you remember what the Bible says? David was a man after God's own heart. Morality matters. Outward behavior matters. Hear me clearly. But what God sees and cares about is the inner person that bears fruit that is right in and out of season. And in David's case, just like us, there was a really bad season where he bore really bad fruit, but his heart is connected with God and is manifested by the fact that he repents and he returns to God, and he's a man after his own heart in a way that Saul does not. So how do we apply this? What does this really look like, boots on the ground in our lives this week? We don't even have to wait till this week. What about tonight or this afternoon? Well, quite simply, let me plainly exhort you to be sensitive this week to what God sees and really cares about, the state and posture of our hearts, not just our behaviors. He cares about those too, but the narrow and difficult way that Jesus is talking about is the way of looking inside. So what does that look like? I could give you lots of examples, but let me just share one. I recall very distinctly an opportunity that I had just a few years ago to merely focus on behavior, which is important, rather than my heart. In addition to the many things going on in my life, for several years, I taught a middle school Bible class at like a local homeschool consortium where my older kids graduated from. And I'm a Protestant, so I don't believe in purgatory, but if there were a Protestant purgatory, I think it might be teaching middle school Bible to a bunch of... I love them, and if you're a middle schooler, I love you. But in this case, it was 21 6th, 7th, and 8th grade boys who were very squirrely and good kids overall, but I was responsible for teaching them Bible once a week. And at times it got pretty crazy, you can imagine, right? And it was a very different environment than I'm used to teaching at a graduate school all the time. It was enjoyable. But one time I was teaching on Genesis 1, and I was exploring with all these students different ways that Christians have read Genesis 1 and trying to expose them that not everyone has read it the same way. Faithful Christians have read it in different ways over the time. And I felt like we had this great conversation, and I left that day saying, wow, that was like really good. They were really engaged into it. So imagine my surprise, imagine my chagrin when I started to hear that several of the mothers were very upset and were talking with each other about some things I had said in class, and it was clear that there was a misrepresentation from the ever faithful report of all these boys going back to their parents. There's some misrepresentation of what I've said, and I began to hear about this, and I thought, what is going on? I know all these people. These are friends. Our kids play on soccer team together, and I'm hearing that they're upset, and it's sort of boiling up. And I was just flooded with so many negative emotions of anxiety and worry and regret and maybe some embarrassment and then anger. I thought, what are these people doing? I'm Dr. Pennington. How dare they criticize me, right? And all ththese things. And why didn't they come to me and ask me about it rather than they're all talking with each other and upset? So I sat down. I knew I had to write an email to all the parents. So I sat down and just wrote this, very holier than thou kind of email, rebuking them for not coming to me personally, quoting Matthew 18 and all these kind of things. And thankfully, my wife walked by and looked over my shoulder and said, I don't think you want to send that. Thankfully, I didn't, right? And so I decided, okay, I'm going to take the humble road, and I wrote them a very kind, humble note apologizing for any ways I had miscommunicated and, apologizing and trying to, promising I'd clarify it the next week. So I was very proud of myself, right? Because external behavior does matter. Like if I would have sent off that blast of an email, that would have been bad. Bad for them, bad for me, right? I've been a Christian long enough to just know that you need to be civil with people, right? There's wisdom in that. So I was very proud of myself that I took the low road, the humble road, and handled it really well. Good job, me, right? And then I kept noticing over the next several days that I was still so angry, that I was still so frustrated that in, again, the theater starring Jonathan Pennington, where I should be honored at all times and exalted and liked by everyone, that these people had dared criticize me. And it dawned on me. This is part of the problem of being a Sermon on the Mount scholar. You have to actually apply it to your life, right? It dawned on me, yeah, I did the right thing externally, but there's a deeper work to be done. That I need to really pay attention to my heart. Like, what's going on inside me? Why is it so important to me that everyone like me? Or why is it so important to me that everyone speak well of me? What's going on inside of me? Not them. As I always like to say to my own church and to my students, whenever we read the Bible, it's mirrors before windows. This is for me. These verses are not for me to look upon someone else and say, boy, they should be doing differently. These are mirrors. And friends, that's the more difficult way. That's the narrow and difficult way to actually not be content with just doing the right thing on the outside, as good as that is, but actually looking on the inside. This is what it means to follow Jesus in the harder, more difficult, narrow way of building one's life on Jesus' wisdom, of having a righteousness that is more than skin deep, that is more than just religion, but is actually looking on the inside. So I ask you, what about you? What situations did you face this past week where either you blew it behaviorally and you showed bad fruit, or you bore supposedly good fruit, but it turns out it was only that good-looking plastic fruit that's unusable? Or like when you go into a furniture store and they have these like fake televisions that there's no innards in them, right? You could just pick them up, there's nothing inside. God sees and cares about your heart, your inner person. So what do you do? What do you do when you look inside in those situations or any other and you see that your heart is not aligned? You cry out to the Lord. Lord, have mercy. I believe, help my unbelief. You do the only thing you can do. You be honest with God. You don't just try to do more things. You don't try to cover it up. You don't try to deny it. You don't try to self-justify. Just be honest that is who you are. Because this is the gospel, friends, that God sees and cares about your heart. That's bad news. The good news is God sees and cares about your heart. He wants to transform you in the inner person, because it is so tiring to just try to keep up appearances, isn't it? It's so tiring. There's no life there. But if you will look inside, be honest with God, and turn to Him, either for the very first time, maybe today you're not a Christian, and you're hearing this and you know this is true of you, that when you look inside, you see all kinds of stuff, you've been trying so hard to be a good person, and you just cannot sustain it. You're in a great place this morning. Because you turn to the Lord and say, yes, this is true of me, and you know that He looks upon you with a smiling face. And maybe you've been a Christian 50 years, and today you're thinking about some ways in your life that you're just showing up externally and you're not willing to look inside. Today's the day as well. This is good news for you and me, that when we do the difficult and narrow work of looking inside, God meets us there. Because He knows that already about you, and He loves you. He looks upon you with a smiling face and invites you to come and find healing in the inner person. Let me pray for us.